The studio lights burned hot, but the room itself felt oddly cool, like the air was waiting for something it couldn't name. The band had just finished its intro. The host tossed out a line about internet jokes and martial arts legends, and the audience laughed on cue. It was smooth, familiar, the way late-night television always was, until Chuck leaned an inch closer to the microphone. 7 minutes, he said. That's how long they tell me I was dead. The words didn't land like a punchline. They settled heavy, like dust on glass. People stopped shifting in their chairs. The red tally light glared from the camera, but the audience wasn't looking at the host anymore. They were looking at Chuck. The host chuckled automatically. 7 minutes? That's a dramatic teaser. You sure this isn't a Texas-sized story? The smile was professional, but it thinned around the edges. Chuck didn't smile back. It isn't a story, he said quietly. It happened. That was when the laughter stalled. The woman in the front row folded her hands tight. A man in a baseball cap slid it off without noticing. Somewhere above, the crew hesitated, not sure if they should cut to commercial or let the silence breathe. The host tried again, softer this time. Walk us into it. What do you remember? Chuck exhaled once. A few years ago, after training. Nothing heavy, just routine. I felt the floor slip even though it didn't move. Smell of mats. Coffee cooling on the bench. My wife's voice, sharper than the rest. Then noise, not loud, like shutting a car door and hearing the world on the other side of the glass. The audience didn't stir. It wasn't a performance anymore. Doctors worked the checklist, Chuck continued. Compressions, needles, drugs. To them, procedure. To me, it was the first time I knew I wasn't the one driving. The host set his cards face down. His usual grin stayed, but not his rhythm. And you saw something? Chuck nodded once. Not a tunnel, no bright light. A bridge. Old wood. Boards worn by boots that weren't walking anymore. Behind me, the sound of every voice I've ever loved. Ahead, nothing. But the nothing pulled harder than anything else ever had. A ripple moved through the seats, the kind of shared shiver people don't admit to. The bandleader froze above the keys. Even the cameras seemed to steady. You know how this sounds, the host said, half apology, half warning. I do, Chuck answered. It sounded that way to Namiya, too. Until it didn't. He rested both hands on his knees, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the lens. Belief and doubt feel the same at the start, he said. They both ask you to take a step. Nobody moved. The studio was a held breath. The host leaned in despite himself. And after you stepped? Chuck's jaw flexed, preparing. That's when I realized I wasn't alone out there. The voice I heard wasn't mine. The audience drew air in unison, loud enough for the boom mics to catch. The host's pen rolled off the desk and tapped the floor. What did it say? He asked, too careful to sound casual. Chuck's gaze stayed steady, not daring, not dramatic, just unflinching. We'll get to that, he said softly. You asked where it began. It began with 7 minutes and a bridge. The tally light blinked, signaling the break. But no one in the studio moved, not even when the bumper music crept in. They just kept watching, waiting for him to finish the path he'd only just started to describe. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, bellow. He didn't start with drama. He started with temperature. The room ran hot, he said. Not fever, just the kind of heat a gym holds near closing. Rubber mats, metal tang, sweat turning sweet in the air. I finished light drills, sat to lace my shoe, and felt the edges of the room unhook. Like the corners stepped back a half-inch and left me in a shape that didn't fit. He knew the difference between pain and warning. This wasn't pain. It was information his body didn't have words for. He stood, because standing was what he had always done when he didn't know what came next. The floor rose toward him anyway. He sat before he fell. An old habit, a veteran's courtesy to gravity. Someone asked if he needed water. He said no and heard how far away it sounded. His wife's hand found his shoulder, and the warmth there convinced him this was simply a dizzy spell with better marketing. He exhaled to steady the room. The exhale caught. The noise came next. The hum of the fluorescent ballast, the muted thump of a treadmill belt still coasting, the tiny wheeze of a foam roller being dragged across rubber. Every sound lifted away from the others, then flattened into one soft, velvety hiss, the way rain sounds from inside a sealed car. Conversation blurred. Names moved through him like birds in fog. He focused on a single detail to anchor himself, the way a strip of athletic tape fluttered on the edge of a mirror every time the AC kicked. It fluttered twice. After the third, he couldn't tell if it moved because the tape moved or because he did. Someone said his name again, nearer. A phone dialed 3 digits with the confidence of a plan that has already saved lives. He watched his wife's mouth form instructions, calm and fast. He loved the shape of her competence. Loved it so much, he wanted to stay and applaud it. His chest didn't agree. The drop wasn't a plunge, it was a shrug, like a set of shoulders you trusted with your weight, deciding today they would not carry you. He was there, and then he was not there, in a way only the body can understand. He heard the scrape of a box being dragged open, the plastic crackle of a sealed kit. He was placed on his back. The ceiling tiles arranged themselves into a grid a child could count. He tried to count them. Numbers slipped like minnows. The hiss gathered a pulse. Beep, beep, too slow, then faster, then jagged. Pressure arrived in the flat of his breastbone. 1, 2, 3. Compressions marching with professional certainty. He had been hit before. This wasn't a hit. This was insistence given hands. Each press knocked a fraction of air loose. Each release chased it back in. He tried to speak and realized that speech requires a body to obey. Someone's forearm braced his forehead, fingers sweeping his airway the way you check a pocket for keys you know you didn't put there. "Stay with me," a voice said. It was a sentence he had told 100 younger men on tougher nights. Hearing it spoken to him felt like being handed his own history. He described the paramedics the way only grateful people describe strangers. Boots, precise, radios, clipped, faces, busy but not hurried. They went to work, he said. They didn't look for meaning. They looked for signs. Pads met skin with a cold so clean it felt like a new language. A synthetic voice announced a rhythm judgment, rational and indifferent. Someone cleared. Electricity wrote its single sentence and was gone. Time became rubber. He could measure it only by the repetitions of things other people did on his behalf. Compression cycles, bag squeezes, the little upward lurch when the shock came and took nothing he could name in payment. He floated in and out of the room he used to own with a body he no longer did. And through all of it, he said, I could hear her. Not the words, tone, timbre, the way love learns command when it needs to. She stood close enough for fear to smell like perfume, and far enough to let the professionals do their work. She said his name like a line tied from the dock to a boat drifting toward current. He clung because clinging was the one verb still available to him. He didn't say he was brave. He said he was surprised by how little courage mattered. "You think you'll make a speech," he told the host. "You don't. You notice stupid details. The ceiling has a stain the shape of a boot print. The AED pad says, 'Peel from corner.' The guy on the left wears his watch upside down so he can see it while he bags. Those are the last things you own. Facts, not choices. Procedure stacked on procedure. 4. Meds he couldn't name. A ring cut loose. A shirt sheared away with a sound he later remembered better than he remembered the shocks. The beeps sped, then wavered, then straightened. Someone called out numbers that belonged to him but didn't feel like they did. He tried to answer a question no one had asked, and slid instead into a place where questions didn't fit. He felt the border before he saw anything that could be called a scene. The room thinned. Gravity loosened its handshake. Not floating. Detached. The tape on the mirror didn't flutter because there was no tape. No mirror, no air to stir them. The hiss quieted until it wasn't sound anymore, but an idea of silence. On the studio monitor, the host's face had lost the last traces of his grin. He didn't interrupt. Someone in the third row dabbed at her eye and pretended she had an itch. "I didn't get a tunnel," Chuck said. "I didn't get trumpets. I got a fact. I wasn't in charge. My job was to see what was in front of me and decide without hands." The last thing he remembered from the gym was a number shouted over him. 7! A count of minutes no one wanted to keep counting. The next thing was something so simple he struggled to make it sound like anything at all. This is where the air in the studio tightened, as if the whole room leaned toward a door it couldn't see. "You asked what I saw," he said, eyes steady. "Not yet. First you need what I didn't see. No body, no machines, no ceiling, no straps. Only the sense that the floor had been replaced by something that would hold if I stepped." He lifted a hand an inch, palm down, remembering the test of it. "And then there was a place to stand." He stopped there, not because the story ended, but because stories that go farther need an audience willing to follow. The host found his voice and kept it low. "And you stepped?" Chuck's mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something like acceptance. "I did," he said. "That's where the gym ended." He let the silence complete the sentence. "And where the bridge began." The bridge wasn't made for men anymore. That was the first thought he remembered having. Old timber, blackened like driftwood. Boards that bent but never broke beneath his weight. It extended into nowhere, each step forward swallowed by fog the color of smoke left in an ashtray. Below, nothing. No water, no land, only distance that refused to end. "I knew it wasn't real," Chuck said, "but it was more real than anything I had ever trained for." He walked carefully, listening to the boards groan. Behind him rose faint sound, laughter, voices he recognized, his mother humming a hymn, a friend calling his name the way he had years ago on set. The easy chorus of a life lived among people who mattered. Each voice felt like a hand tugging him gently backward, toward warmth. Ahead lay silence. Not threatening, not empty. Seductive. A quiet so absolute it promised release from the weight of being needed, from the grind of decisions and expectations. That silence didn't call his name, yet it drew harder than all the voices combined. Then he saw someone on the bridge. The shape sharpened as fog curled away. His brother. The same crooked grin he remembered before Vietnam swallowed him. The same stance, shoulders squared, like he'd never left. Chuck froze. His body should have run forward, but something anchored his legs. He didn't speak, Chuck recalled. He just looked at me, like he knew I was too stubborn to follow without a reason. The grin faltered, and then the figure lifted a hand in a gesture half wave, half warning. Chuck stepped once toward him. The timber creaked, but held. That was when the pull of silence surged, rushing up from the void under the planks. It wasn't a noise. It was gravity without direction, promising rest. His brother faded like a photograph overexposed. "Everything in me wanted to let go," he said. "Not from fear. From peace. It was easier than anything I'd ever faced. But then, a voice, clear and undeniable, cut through the hush. It wasn't his brother's, wasn't family, wasn't anyone he could name. Yet it carried authority he recognized in his bones. "Your task isn't finished." The words struck like orders given in the field, plain and final. He turned, looking for the source, but the bridge stretched empty in both directions. The fog stirred, and for a moment he saw his wife's face, eyes fixed on him, lips moving with prayers. She wasn't here, not really, but she was. That tether pulled tighter than the silence. He tried to move forward again, but the boards refused him. He could only step back. And as he did, the voices behind grew louder. His brother still stood there, but now smiling fully, as if to say, "Not yet." "I understood then," Chuck said softly, his eyes still locked beyond the studio. "The choice wasn't about me. It was about everyone still waiting." The host shifted uncomfortably in his chair, as if the ground itself had grown unsteady. "So you turned back?" Chuck nodded. "I didn't run. I didn't leap. I just let myself return." The bridge dissolved. The fog closed in. He felt the weight of gravity return like a hammer dropped into his chest. He heard the beeping again, sharp and desperate. Voices calling medical codes. His wife's plea tearing through all of it. He gasped, the first breath slamming into his lungs like fire. Hands pressed, machines screamed, and the world came roaring back. In the studio, he let the silence hang after those words. No one clapped. No one laughed. The audience sat suspended, every person privately measuring their own belief. Finally, the host leaned forward, his voice nearly breaking. "Chuck, what was on the other side of that silence? What did you almost step into?" Chuck's mouth tightened. He didn't answer right away. His hands rested flat against his knees, knuckles pale. Then he looked up. "That," he said, "is the part I still don't know how to tell." The camera light blinked. The showrunner signaled to cut for a break, but the audience didn't move, unwilling to miss what might come next. The words, "Your task isn't finished," had barely faded when fire slammed through his chest. He jerked as if a hammer had struck bone from the inside. In the studio, he spoke slowly, each sentence separated by pauses that left the audience holding their breath. "That was the moment the current hit. I didn't know it then, but they'd shocked me back. The fog dissolved in an instant. The bridge, the silence, even the outline of his brother shattered like glass underfoot. All that remained was pain, raw and bright, flooding through his ribs. His body arched against straps he hadn't remembered being tied. His lungs seized. The first sound he made was not a breath, but a groan so low that only his wife heard it. She gripped his hand, knuckles white, tears streaming unchecked. She whispered his name again and again, but the syllables broke apart each time. He could feel the tremor in her fingers, a living tether dragging him back from wherever he had gone. For her, that touch was desperation. For him, it was proof that he had not let go. Around them, the room erupted. The rhythm of command barked out by medics. Clear! Pulse check! Push! Epi! Layered over the shrill alarms of machines, the slap of rubber soles on tile, the metallic click of instruments unwrapped in haste. A second ago, he had been in a place where sound did not exist. Now the world screamed at him. In the studio, he let that image linger. It felt like being slammed between two worlds. One offered peace. The other offered pain and obligation. His eyes moved across the silent rows of listeners. Guess which one the body chooses. The host fumbled with his notes, clearly unsettled. He tried to steer the conversation back toward medicine. So, the defibrillator worked. The team pulled you through. But Chuck shook his head. To them, yes. It was victory. Procedure followed, skill proven. They wrote numbers on a chart. For me, it wasn't a machine that won, it was something larger. I came back because I wasn't finished. The contrast landed heavily. The audience could picture the sterile precision of doctors and machines, yet, against it, stood a man who insisted that purpose, not electricity, had been decisive. A few skeptical chuckles stirred at the edges of the crowd, but no one dared laugh outright. He described the helplessness of those first seconds back. His eyes were open, but his limbs refused him. He heard his wife crying, but could not squeeze her hand. He saw the medics congratulating each other, yet inside, he remained on the edge, still half-anchored to the bridge that had almost claimed him. That's when it hit me, he continued. Death isn't the fight. Coming back is, the line struck hard. Even the cameramen shifted, their lenses steady, but their shoulders tense. In the control booth, the producer signaled for silence. No cutaways, no music. Let the moment breathe. Chuck explained that his recovery began not in the hospital, but in the awareness that he'd been forced to return for a reason he still didn't understand. The doctors framed it as survival. He knew better. It was assignment. The tension in the studio thickened as he leaned closer to the microphone. You see, when you wake up from something like that, you don't just heal. You wrestle. You wrestle with why you're still here. And that fight is harder than any I ever faced in the ring. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. The pain faded. My breath returned, but the question never left. What now? He paused, giving space for the weight of it. A woman in the front row nodded through tears. Others sat rigid, unsure whether they wanted the next answer. And that, Chuck said finally, was only the beginning. The host swallowed. His polished confidence cracked. You mean the struggle didn't end once you woke? Chuck's eyes held his. No, he said firmly. That's when it truly began. The studio held still, waiting for what would follow. He told the studio that waking up was the easy part. Living with it was the work. The first week, He measured progress by inches, sitting up without the world tilting, crossing a room without his heart hammering at the door. But the body makes a fast bargain with survival. It mends. What didn't mend was the silence that had almost taken him. It followed him home, into the kitchen at dawn, into the garage where old belts hung beside tools, into the small hours when the house breathed and he could not. He tried to go back to set. The lights made him blink, not from brightness, but from memory, another kind of light that didn't need electricity. He hit his marks, said his lines, felt the choreography return to his joints like a song learned long ago. Crew clapped. The director grinned. He walked back to his trailer and sat on the edge of a narrow couch, staring at his hands. "Does this matter?" he asked the quiet. The quiet did not argue. That was worse than any critic. He tried the gym. The old rhythms felt honest. Raps, breath, the knuckles' dull report on bag leather. He moved well enough, but purpose lagged behind power like a shadow missing its man. Between rounds, he caught himself looking at the mat the way people look at maps they're not sure they can trust anymore. Public life resumed on schedule, even if he didn't. The interview requests multiplied. Curiosity is a market that never closes. Some hosts came to listen. Others came to win. He learned to hear the difference by the second question, and the noise began. Headline writers who'd never met him decided what he meant. "Legend claims visit to afterlife," one site barked. "PR stunt from aging star," another sniffed. Columnists spent a week diagnosing him from 3 quotes and an angle. A late-night monologue tried a punchline and found the crowd reluctant to laugh. He watched none of it directly. Friends sent links he didn't click. And still, the gist leaked under the door. Colleagues split along fault lines he hadn't known existed. A younger actor caught him at a charity gala and said, eyes bright with sincerity, "What you said gave my mom peace." A producer, not unkind, but wired for budgets and outcomes, cautioned him to keep it tasteful. A veteran stuntman gripped his forearm with the quiet fraternity of men who have seen things fall apart, and said, "I know that bridge." And they hugged in a hallway that smelled like coffee and dust. The studio audience became the third combatant in his new fight. You could feel them, each crowd a weather system, arrive with their own forecasts. Some leaned forward, ready to believe before he spoke. Others folded their arms, committed to skepticism as a form of self-respect. He didn't try to sort them. He spoke as if to one person who might need what he had to say, and left the rest to make their own weather. The host across from him tonight had started in the shallow end and had been pulled, against his instincts, into depth. He flipped a card, hesitated, and said, "You understand the position you put us in. We're entertainers. You're giving us a sermon?" Chuck shook his head. "No, I'm giving you a report." From the cheap seats, a laugh tried to rise and died before it cleared the row. The cameras edged closer. You could hear bracelets slide on a woman's wrist when she folded her hands. "I'm not selling anyone a map," he continued. "I'm telling you, I stood on a bridge. If it sounds crazy, that's all right. It sounded crazy to me until I ran out of excuses." The host tilted his head, searching for his footing. "But isn't it possible this was hypoxia, neurons misfiring, the brain doing—" "Possible?" Chuck said. "Of course. The brain does what it does. The doctors saved my life. I'm grateful to them." He let that gratitude fill the room, undeniable and specific. But we don't ask MRIs to tell us why we love someone. We don't ask blood work to define courage. Sometimes facts and meaning shake hands without needing to agree on every detail. The skepticism regrouped. A columnist in the second row raised his voice just enough to be heard. "So you're saying we should take your word for it?" "I'm saying I'm not asking you for anything," Chuck replied. "Believe me, don't. I still have to wake up in my own skin tomorrow. That's where the fight is." He described a day on set when a young extra, seeing him alone, sat and asked, "Sir, were you scared?" He'd answered honestly, "Not there." The boy frowned. "So now?" Chuck nodded. "Now is harder. Now I keep choosing why I stayed." Laughter didn't fit. Applause tried and restrained itself. The audience moved as one organism from appetite for spectacle to something like reverence, and then to uncertainty again. They wanted a tidy moral. He refused to polish the edges. The host, sensing both the risk and the moment, leaned on the question that had to be asked. "Forgive me," he said, "but, to be clear, do you truly believe you saw death?" Chuck considered the words, then shook his head. "No," he said, and the refusal surprised half the room. "I didn't see death. I saw what's beyond it." The sentence hit like a clean strike. No wind-up, no flourish, just impact. Someone in the balcony whispered a prayer they hadn't planned to say aloud. Somewhere near the bandstand, a stagehand wiped his eye and pretended it was dust. The host pressed, gently now. "Then what do you do with that? How do you reconcile movies, fame, training, all of it, with a voice that says your task isn't finished?" "I start asking different questions," Chuck said. "Not, how do I stay on top? Not, how do I look unbreakable? I ask, what am I for? And every time I answer, the bridge moves a little farther behind me." He told them about turning down a role that paid well and meant nothing, about taking his wife's hand on a Tuesday morning and choosing a walk instead of another meeting designed to keep him visible. He spoke of letters from strangers, one from a nurse in Ohio who'd sat with a dying man and whispered the words, "not alone," because she'd heard them here first. He spoke of the anger, too, the emails that accused him of exploiting grief, the jokes that tried to make the bridge a meme. He did not defend himself against those. He let them be what they were and kept going. "You're calm about the mockery," the host said, half impressed. "I've been hit harder," Chuck said. A few chuckled. The humor landed without puncture. "And usually by better men. Look," he glanced at the crowd, "you don't owe me belief. But if you've ever sat in a dark room and asked whether your work matters, whether your breath matters, then you already know my answer." He stopped there. The stillness didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The studio seemed to lean forward, as if they could all hear the same distant surf. The host tapped a card once, twice, then let it go. "All right," he said quietly. "One more, because the folks at home need a lid on this. After everything you've described, the shock, the bridge, the voice, the noise, what exactly do you believe you were sent back to do?" Chuck looked straight into the lens, as if speaking to a single living room where someone sat with the remote halfway to the table. He opened his mouth, and the band's red light flashed for break. The producer's hand sliced the air, hold. The host lifted a palm in apology to the audience. The room groaned softly, an audible ache. Chuck closed his mouth, not annoyed, not relieved, patient. "I'll answer," he said, and the promise carried more charge than any teaser. "But choose your ears before you listen." The bumper music rose, unwanted and small against the weight in the room. No one reached for their phone, no one stood. They waited, suspended between doubt and hunger, ready to hear the one sentence that might tell them what a man brings back when he turns around on a bridge. The bumper music faded, and the studio shifted into silence. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness, but of gravity, like a room holding its breath before a verdict. The host leaned forward, cards forgotten. "You promised an answer," he said quietly. Chuck nodded. "You asked what I was sent back to do." He looked not at the host, but straight into the camera, into the living rooms where strangers waited. "I wasn't sent back to chase trophies, not to protect a myth. I came back to carry what belongs to me, and to set down what doesn't." The host frowned. "What does that mean?" Chuck's voice was steady. "It means making every second cost what it's worth. It means being present with my wife, instead of half there with a phone in my hand. It means telling the truth to younger men without needing to be worshipped for it. If I died again tonight, no one should have to wonder what I believed my purpose was." He paused. "And it means reminding anyone who'll listen that none of us are alone. Not on a mat, not in a hospital, not on that bridge I stood on." The studio stayed still. Even the band held their instruments as if movement might break the thread. A stagehand near the wall stopped pretending to check his clipboard and simply listened. The host tried to steady the ground. "People will call this faith. Others will call it brain chemistry. Some will say, 'You're just older now.'" Chuck nodded. "All true in their own way. But what you call it isn't the point. The point is what you do after you name it." He folded his hands. "I used to think the hardest blow in life was the one you couldn't shake off, the knockout, the hit that ends you. I was wrong. The hardest blow is the moment you understand why you're here. After that, you can't unknow it." The words struck clean. No one laughed. In the third row, a woman pressed her hand to her mouth. In the balcony, a teenager lowered his phone without realizing. The host's face softened. "And what do you say to those who think you're polishing a legend?" Chuck didn't flinch. "The legend didn't shock my heart back. A medic with a name did. The legend didn't hold my hand when the world went dim. My wife did. 7 minutes felt like forever, and none of them belonged to me. I can't prove what I saw, but I can tell you I'm different because of it." For a long beat, the studio was one organism, suspended between doubt and belief. Chuck leaned forward. "If you're at home on a night when you don't know how to get through, borrow my 7 minutes. Stand where you are. Breathe. Ask yourself what you're for. Then do the next right thing like it matters. Because it does." He didn't smile. He didn't wink. He just let the words settle. Then the red tally light dimmed, signaling the end. No one moved. People stood slowly, as if applauding was less about noise than agreement. The host rose too, not as entertainer, but as a man who'd been reached. He offered his hand. Chuck shook it once, firm and simple. Backstage, corridors smelled of dust and cables. His wife waited, as always, just out of sight of the cameras. They walked toward the exit, hand in hand. Outside, Los Angeles air pressed warm against their faces. Chuck looked up at a sky too bright for stars and said softly, 7 minutes. Not as a boast, but as a measure. When people later retold the story, in kitchens, gyms, quiet cars, they didn't repeat every word. They carried the core. The myth had stepped aside. What remained wasn't invincibility, it was truth.